that's working with just incredible precision. It's your endocrine system. Think of it as this complex web of hormones that's supposed to maintain a perfect internal balance, this fluid symmetry. But what happens when that system gets thrown into absolute chaos? Well, that's what we're going to dig into today, the hidden physiological war that's happening just beneath the surface. We've all heard it a million times, right? That managing weight is just a simple calculation of calories in, calories out. But the real science paints a much, much more unsettling picture. It points to this deep, intricate relationship between our body fat and our hormones, which really forces us to ask a critical question. What if the problem isn't just what you're eating? What if it's a system designed for balance that has actually started to fight against itself? Okay, this brings us to the real chicken or the egg question that trips so many people up. What comes first? Does a hormonal disorder cause you to gain weight, or does gaining weight cause the hormonal disorder? For a really long time, the blame was put squarely on the hormones themselves. But this is where the script just completely flips. Now, don't get me wrong, there are absolutely specific endocrine diseases that can cause weight gain, but the clinical evidence, it overwhelmingly points in the other direction. For the vast, vast majority of people, it's the excess body fat itself that's pulling the trigger on widespread hormonal chaos, not the other way around. And look, this isn't just some theory we're floating. This is a direct statement from the European Society of Endocrinology's own clinical practice guidelines. They call it a two-way relationship, where obesity is both a cause and a consequence of all these changes. It becomes a feedback loop. But the evidence is pretty clear that for most people, that loop starts with obesity. So how in the world does this even happen? How can something we just think of as simple storage tissue wreak so much havoc on our internal chemistry? Well, this is where we start to see the dominoes fall, one by one, as excess fat begins to act like a rogue agent, waging this silent war of inflammation inside the body. Okay, this is absolutely crucial to understand. There's been a fundamental shift in how we see fat. It is not just some inert, passive blob of storage. Your adipose tissue is a living, breathing endocrine organ. Seriously, think of it like a factory that's producing and secreting its own potent chemical signals, not just hormones called adipokines, but a whole host of pro-inflammatory molecules. And just like any other organ, when it becomes unhealthy or it gets overgrown, it starts to malfunction. In the case of obesity, this endocrine organ goes into total overdrive, flooding your body with this constant, low-grade storm of inflammatory signals that basically jam all the communication lines and throw that delicate equilibrium completely out of whack. Let's look at the first domino to fall. This one is a big deal. The chronic inflammatory signals being pumped out by that excess fat directly interfere with insulin, which is the hormone that manages your blood sugar. Your cells, they basically become deaf to insulin's signal. So what does the body do? It shouts louder, pumping out even more insulin. This leads to higher blood sugar, and, critically, it tells the body to store even more fat, especially that really dangerous visceral fat deep in your abdomen. Now let's watch the next domino get knocked over. Your fat cells also produce a hormone called leptin. This is the I'm full hormone. In a balanced system, more fat would mean more leptin, which would tell your brain to stop eating. Simple, right? But in this inflammatory environment caused by obesity, the brain's receptors become resistant to that signal. So even though your body is flooded with leptin, your brain doesn't hear a thing. The off switch for your hunger is broken. And the damage doesn't stop there. The body sees this state of chronic inflammation as a constant, low-grade stressor. This messes with your primary stress response system, the HPA axis, and that leads to elevated levels of the stress hormone cortisol. And what does cortisol do? Well, it encourages the body to store even more of that dangerous, inflammatory visceral fat, creating what researchers literally call a vicious cycle. This just shows you how deep the problem really goes. Your thyroid is basically the engine of your metabolism. Well, those inflammatory signals being constantly pumped out by excess fat tissue can interfere with the conversion of thyroid hormones into their active form. This often leads to something called subclinical hypothyroidism, which means your metabolic rate, your body's basic calorie burn, actually slows down, even if your standard tests look pretty normal. The disruption also hits our sex hormones, and it hits them hard. In men, there's an enzyme in fat tissue that actually converts testosterone to estrogen, and all that inflammation suppresses testosterone production, driving levels way down. In women, the combination of inflammation and insulin resistance is a key driver of PCOS. And then after menopause, the natural drop in estrogen changes how fat is stored, favoring that unhealthy white fat that just fuels even more inflammation and risk.
So when you put all of these dominoes together, you've got insulin resistance, leptin resistance, cortisol issues, thyroid dysfunction, sex hormone disruption, all of it fueled by inflammation. You don't just have a list of problems. You have a self-perpetuating runaway freight train. You are literally trapped in a vicious cycle.
Let's just walk through this loop one more time. It starts with an increase in adipose tissue. That tissue then sends out a storm of dysfunctional, inflammatory, and hormonal signals. These signals cripple your metabolism, making your body resistant to insulin and deaf to fullness cues, which of course drives even more fat storage. And that new fat, it just adds more fuel to the inflammatory fire, reinforcing the entire cycle and making the hormonal disruption even worse. It is a physiological trap.
I know, this all sounds incredibly bleak. It feels like an unwinnable internal war. But think about it. If the problem is a feedback loop, then the solution has to break that cycle. So the question becomes, how do we reverse the flow and help the body find its balance again? Well, for the clearest possible answer, we can go directly to the source we mentioned earlier, these comprehensive clinical practice guidelines from the leading endocrinologists in Europe. These folks have studied this exact problem in just immense detail. And their primary recommendation is, well, it's powerful in its simplicity. They state unequivocally that weight loss is the key to restoring hormonal balance. Not hormone replacement, not some magic pill, but addressing the root cause, the excess, inflamed, and malfunctioning fat tissue that started this whole domino effect in the first place. And honestly, this is the most hopeful part of this entire story. Our bodies have this profound capacity to self-correct. The guidelines point out that for most of these key hormones, from your thyroid to your cortisol to your testosterone, the system can actually find its way back to equilibrium once the primary disruptor is reduced. By breaking the cycle, you give your body a chance to heal itself. So I think the final takeaway here is this. The battle with weight is so rarely just about willpower. It is very often a silent internal war where your own biology has been turned against you. And it really leaves us with a truly unsettling thought about our own bodies. What does it mean when the very system designed for our survival and balance becomes the engine of its own dysfunction?